7. What happened if sigma equals 1? On May. What happened if W equals 0? Those are straight questions. What happens in figure 31 if this happens? The only tricky questions are going to be tricky. They're going to involve three masters. I'm going to, so that you know, these are the questions that I'm literally the questions that I'm going to be putting in the final exam. So this will be a good way of getting a grip on what the final looks like and what the answers to the finals are. So we want to do this. You don't have to give this to me or to answers. I want you to do this. You want to do it in team, by all means. You want to do it just you and somebody else, by all means. Just make sure that you have it. Okay? These are the questions in the final. Not the only one, but these are the questions. Okay. What I want to do now is move on to inflation targeting. Yeah, this is going to be a great day for me. All right. So the first material is going to be coming from the book by Truman. That book goes, you don't have to read the whole thing. So there are several chapters that I want you to read, and they're easy reading. So, but he goes into, let's do inflation targeting for Brazil. What about Chile? Well, the same thing. Oh, what about Bolivia? Oh, it's a deal. So, you know, there's a lot of music in that book. And if you were after, if you had to make a decision by next week of whether you're going to follow or not inflation targeting, well, that's the book to use. But that's not what you're going to be doing here. So I think, however, that the book is very persuasive in laying out what is it and what is required to implement. Okay, so this is the outline of what we're going to do. The first thing is that we're going to go over, I don't know what this is. You don't see half of the crap that I have in front of me. And I got all kinds of weird things. Okay, good. Crap gone. All right, so we're gonna, what I want to do is, I'm gonna be defining what is inflation targeting. Not so much from a standpoint of theoretical economics, but okay, let's do it. We're gonna see that there are two frameworks. One is called constrained discretion, and the other one is communication strategy. The framework has two parts. A big deal in inflation targeting is accountability. When the central bank says, I'm going to do this, well, you're now accountable. And so there are going to be the central banker, the conservative central banker, and the rewards. We have seen this already. Okay? And then what we're going to do is the implementation. Implementation with inflation forfeit, inflation targeting is, there are many ways of doing it. There's something called a Taylor rule, there's something called the Callan rule. There are rules for everything. And so what we're going to do is, I'm going to focus on the Taylor rule. Partly because to me it is truly persuasive, partly because you'll see this next time. The US Congress is now thinking of passing legislation that forces the Fed to follow a particular Taylor rule. Right? And so that is something. And so we want to see that Taylor rule in action. is, if you want, the Truman State. That targeting inflation is not something that, oh, we used to be doing this, now we're gonna be targeting the inflation rate. Central banks will target something. That's what they do. In the conventional macroeconomics setup, when we have this in the lending schedule, when we have a money market, the central bank is targeting the money supply. And there's nothing biblical, there's nothing superior about the targeting of the money supply versus the targeting of, say, the exchange rate. So if a country has a fixed exchange rate, then the central bank is targeting the exchange rate. If the central bank is, and so you have money, the exchange rate, and why not the inflation rate? And so the first thing is to recognize that day-to-day functioning central banks will target something. Central banks, the way they operate, they do not assume that the economy is functioning smoothly, and so we just have to sit here and then pretend that we know something. So that's the first observation. The second observation is that monetary policy can affect income in the short run, but not in the long run. Okay, you saw that in either the ISLM framework or in the Kitland-Prescott. Central bank could move to a lower indifference curve, but that is a short run gain. It's not going to be a long run gain. Monetary policy can affect prices. Some people will say only prices. And the way it's written here sounds like prices are being determined by these other things, and one of which is monetary policy. The central bank, at least the Federal Reserve's view, is that the prices are determined in the long run by monetary policy. And then finally, this is an observation about day-to-day realities, is that monetary policy works with a lag. In other words, the change in monetary policy today will not affect the economy today, it will affect the economy with a delay. What that means is that monetary policy, a good practice in central banking is not to be reactive, but to be proactive, to see what's coming, and then says we need to avoid that development. It's not all that. I love these little analogies because they're so silly and somehow they're being recorded, and I just enjoy myself listening to this. And so, but imagine that you are at the beach and things look okay. You're actually in the water, and you see a gigantic wave coming at you. It's not right there in front of you. It's on the horizon, and it's not an optical illusion. And so it's like, God, am I seeing things now? No. So you ask your friend, do you see that gigantic wave in front of us? Yeah, it's right there. Now at this point, you can have several attitudes. One is, my recommendation is get out. Right? That's what I call proactive. You see something bad coming your way, ditch. Or you can say, I'm going to wait until the wave is a little bit in front of me, so ditching is not part of the cards. And so what do? You get underneath the wave. So you can do that, or you can hope for the best, right? That somehow between then and now, something will happen that the wave will just diminish. So you can do all these things. Central bank does not entertain these things, right? Central bank says there's a big wave coming there. We have to do something. What is that something? In this analogy, ditch. Central bank says we see inflation coming. We have to take a policy decision today, because once you see inflation, it is too late to react. Think of this as the religion of central bank. Once inflation is in place, it is too late. So the central banks are always trying to avoid being too late. And so when they see that inflation, they see a development here that is going to affect inflation in the future, they take decisions today. Okay. As a result of that, inflation forecast plays a role. The way I described the little example example, the day at the beach example is that there's no ambiguity. There is a wave coming at you. You don't have to forecast. Maybe the only forecasting left is how long it's gonna take to get from there to here. And you're not gonna be trying to say, well, what model should I use? You say, I'm beaching, right? So, but in the case of central bank, they have to forecast inflation in the future, see what it looks like, and then react to something that has not happened, whether it is being forecast to happen. This is very different than the ISLM framework. The ISLM framework does not allow for the central bank to foresee developments in the future and then say, well, let's do this, the ISLM framework is always reacting. And it is always reacting because it does not have expectations. It's an integral part of it. When you have expectations, the future matters. All right. The next question is, how important should inflation be to the central bank? If the central bank is gonna say, somehow there's a method there that we have not described yet, but that somehow is gonna tell us that if we use it, we will get the inflation rate that we want. Should the central bank focus exclusively on the inflation rate, a truly conservative central bank? Or should the central bank also allow for movements on the real side of the economy? You did the experimentation in the first assignment. You saw that you can have a policy rule that allows for movements in output and movements in inflation, and then you examine the implications of changing the policy. If we say, no, we're not going to give a damn about economic activity, no, we're not going to give a damn about unemployment, then we're done. I mean, fine, let's go. There's no ambiguity. We know what to do, we know how to do it. We are a conservative central bank. That expansion path is lying exactly on the horizontal axis. Let's go. If, however, we entertain ambiguity such as we should give, we should care about unemployment rate. We're not the central bank from Mars trying to dictate policy in the United States. We are part of that society. We were not quite elected, but we were appointed by people that got elected. So in principle, we ought to be responsible for what's going on in the country. And so, well, if we do that, inflation targeting may be a way of having both. Maybe an approach to caring about inflation and caring about unemployment. And the way that's going to be done is called constrained discretion and communication strategy. Let me say this, that the area of inflation targeting is very close to creative fiction. Right? It's trying to say the same thing with different words and pretending that those different words are so different that they convey an entirely different meaning. For example, what is constrained discretion? Well, I don't know, right? Because I don't know how constrained that discretion is going to be. The alternative would be unconstrained. Well, that is exactly what discretion means. If I have discretion, if you tell me you can do whatever you want only in this room, well, that's not discretion. People are beginning to come to the realization that this inflation targeting thing is just a bunch of words. Okay? And we're going to, and I want you to be exposed to that. Not because it's fun, it is, but because I want you to be a truly critical reader of what gets published, a truly critical reader of policy decisions. I don't want you to raise a flag. I am like them. I want you to be critical. Right. Okay, let's go. So what is inflation targeting? We're going to define that there is an ultimate target. In this case, the central bank is going to set an The next question is, and we didn't notice that we didn't do this in the Kidman Nebraska. Fine, so there's the inflation target. We're going to assume that this effectively comes from the mountain. We're not going to say, how do you determine the target inflation rate? How did the Federal Reserve decided that the target inflation rate is 2%? Don't know. Somehow they talk about it, they entertain the alternatives, and arrive at the conclusion that 2 is about right. Fine, so we take that as given. The next issue is, how do we get there? Suppose the inflation rate is above the target. How do we get there? I don't mean that. What policy tools do we use? Well, the framework that we're going to use is one that has something called an instrument. So we have target, and we have instrument. The instrument is the interest rate. And so what we have in here is a central bank moving the interest rate up and down so as to attain the target rate. In the exercise that you did, the Mankey model, the equation for the interest rate was called the policy rule. And so that rule said that if the inflation rate is above the target, you raise the interest rate, and you lower the interest rate otherwise. Okay? And so what we have in here is that we want that, and we have an instrument. We need to decide how are we going to do that. And what we have in this framework, what is decided, is to have the interest rate. There's going to be, answering these two first questions is central, but not enough, because we need to ask a question of, in particular, what interest rate are we going to use? And second, how large changes are we willing to tolerate in order to attain the target? In other words, should we allow the interest rates to rise to, say, 600% in order to achieve the target? You know, you say 600% sounds like I'm making fun, or like the next thing I'm going to say is unicorns. 600% is the interest rate that Sweden was charging immediately prior. The Sweden central bank immediately prior to the collapse of the exchange rate mechanism in 1992. Their target was to keep the exchange rate fixed. They were subject to a tax, speculative tax, and the only way they were able to deal with it was to raise the interest rate to 600%. 600% is a huge number. There's no way of saying, well, it depends. No, there's no depending here. The issue that arises in inflation targeting is, what is the range that we're allowed to tolerate? Is 600% in the cards? No. And the next thing that we're going to do is how do we translate information about targets, about instruments, into an equation? I don't mean something like y equals f of x. That I can do. I want to know exactly what that f of x is. No kind of. Or, so what's constraint expression? Again, I'm sorry, I just get hung up in the words. And constraint expression is sounds to me like a contradiction in terms of me, but that's my problem, nor yours. I'm just trying to alert you to these words that you're going to have. Rigid inflation target, flexible inflation target, not quite rigid, not quite flexible. And it's going to be a nuisance because the authors are trying to convey an idea, and the net outcome of that process is ambiguity. So you will not know what do these things mean unless you have it in front of you and ask them, what do you mean by this? And you will have a chance to do it. All right. Constraint discretion strikes a balance between strict policy rules, Kidman and Prescott, and complete autonomy. So it strikes a balance between discretions and rules, so it's called constraint discretion. It is not as rigid as Kidman and Prescott would like, and it is not pure discretionary policy. So monetary policy can function, can do something. It's just that there are limits to what it can do. So they call that constraint The central bank cares mainly about inflation, but not exclusively. So you're beginning to see the sources of ambiguity here, I hope, because when I say I strike a balance, that's ambiguous, because I'm not saying how is that balance being strict. When I say cares mainly about inflation, well, we're introducing ambiguities into the policy process. And the process of what happens when the inflation rate deviates from target, what happens in that particular instance? How do you make sure that when you react to the deviation, you don't rattle the credibility case? How do you make sure that inflation rates remain anchored? How do you make sure that people are not going to misinterpret your actions as saying, this is a completely crazy central bank. They're going to be expanding the money supply from here on out. We have to revise our inflationary expectations. This is the case of the United States. Not so much now, but maybe 2 or 3 years ago. The balance sheet of the Federal Reserve was about $800 billion in, let's just call it September of 2008. By November of 2008, this is a few months, it had doubled to 1.6 trillion. The balance sheet of the Federal Reserve today is in excess of $4 trillion. So over the span of a little, let's just call it 5 years, the monetary policy in the United States has been as expansionary as it has never been. The United States is not unique in this regard. Japan has been, the ECB has been, the Bank of England has been. So we're now seeing a period where monetary policy has taken a very expansionary stance. And so far, the expectations of the inflation rate have remained, if you want, about what they used to be. And you say, well, how come? How come the central banks were able to expand the money supply without affecting inflationary expectations? That's where the role of credibility is. Credibility is another word with a fair amount of ambiguity built in. And we will see more of that later on. What I ultimately want for you is to realize or recognize that inflation targeting is not about reacting. It's not that, oh crap, the inflation rate is too high, let's do something now. It's too late. Inflation targeting is saying, if we don't do something today, then we're going to have high inflation, and then it will be too late. So it's about anticipating, it's about reacting. It's not about, oh, there's too much traffic in here, let's take a different route. Okay. Now, the central bank, or the process of inflation targeting, is one in which the central bank needs to communicate to society at large what it's doing, to what extent those functions have been successful or not. I think for my take, the country that has the best reporting on this is the United Kingdom, with the Bank of England. So that you know, and this is Roman and Peter are going to like this, so that you know, the chair of the Bank of England is Canadian. It's not that he was born in Canada and raised in England. He was born, raised in Canada, retained a big position in Canada, and the Bank of England said, let's bring Carrot here. So this is chit chat about central bankers. So it's not of the essence. Okay? The Bank of England is a standard. It's the gold standard for inflation reporting, and I'm going to take you through some of the things they do, and some of the what I find to be appealing features of what they're doing. Okay. So communication is of the essence for inflation targeting. It is not that the central bank is going to say, oh, we know best, please trust us. We will target the inflation rate. No, those days are really gone. The new days are where the central bank says, hey, I'm doing this. Feel free to ask questions about it, and I will try to answer them. And the extent to which the chair of the central bank answers those questions will determine the extent to which the central bank is credible or not. If I say, I mean, you saw some of the questions that Chair Yellen was being asked. They were not like, oh, do you like blue better than pink? They were very pointed questions. And failure on the part of the central bank to answer those questions is bad news. The ECB also has press conferences after their policy decision. Kenji, the Bank of Japan also has press conferences after their decisions or no?
Press conference after the decision, yeah.
They do. So the idea is central banks are not they're not taking our trust as given. They are telling us what they're doing. And it is not that they're telling us what they're doing in terms of things that we cannot see. They're telling us things that they're doing in terms of things that we can see. So it's not that, oh, we're just gonna go through the motions of telling us something that you cannot check. No, you can check this. All right. Number one, there has to be discussion. The first one is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of price stability? You remember the little chart that I had about the three bankers, B0, B1, and B completely flat. But if we want to, if we honestly got one inflation targeting, we have to go into this with our eyes open, because the volatility of unemployment is going to be truly large. And so if that's what we want, let's go. But that has to be something that we decide as opposed to the central bank imposes on the rest of society. I don't know what this Truman thing is doing there. The next thing is that we have to agree on what is the target inflation rate. It is one thing to say, let's target the inflation rate, and it is quite another to say, well, what value? And how do we take that from it? In the case of the Federal Reserve, the target is 2%. I think that's about the same target as the ECB. I think the United Kingdom is 2.5. And there are going to be some differences depending on what's the target for Japan, Kenji?
2%.
2%? So you can see that there is, if nothing else among central banks, an agreement among central bankers. See that Kenji works for the Central Bank of Japan, so it's not that he's the subject or the object of my annoyances. Is that I know he's from the Central Bank of Japan. So if he doesn't know the answer, well, then that's going to be bad news. Don't take me too seriously, okay? All right. And so there's an agreement among central bankers that the target of the inflation rate has to be a low number. Mauricio was showing me this morning that the one for the Bank of Mexico is now 4%. It used to be 2. So it's 2%. I mean, it used to be 2%. They revised the target to 4%. There has to be a really neat understanding about the functioning of the economy, and this is where things get really messy because we don't know how the economy functions. I mean, we can fool ourselves into thinking that we know. So if we believe that the economy behaves in the way that Mankiw argues, then yeah, okay, we're done. But that doesn't have to be the case. And so we need to reach an agreement as to how the economy functions. And then we need to figure out a horizon whereby the economy returns to the equilibrium. So the chart, Mauricio, you mentioning that chart to me so that I can send it to everybody? Is that? And so here is the chart that he was showing me. So this is time, this is the inflation rate, this is the target. And so you have movements about the inflation rate around the target. And the question is, how long does it take from this point to that point? Is that months, weeks, years, or what? But that's a part of the decision. And so the central bank has to make that, society as a whole has to say, on average, we don't want to be promised that we're going to be back to target in the next 20 years, because for all intents and purposes, that's not target, and that's just kidding around. And so, okay. We need need to have a sense of the progress. I will be showing you the reports from from the Bank of England. And they are exhaustive and truly beautiful to see. You see that stuff and you say, I want to be inflation targeted too. They're just that good looking. I mean, those guys brought the act of reporting to an art. They're just beautiful charts. It allows them for us to redirect the attention away from the trouble to the chart. Man, this chart is something else. And meanwhile, we're just not paying attention to the front. We say, oh, can we change the shade from pink to light green? Let's try. And meanwhile, the economy is tanking, but man, that chart looks great. I'm excited. They don't do that. But you can imagine that if you want people on your side, you have to make it as persuasive as possible. So the reporting thing is going to be a big deal. You have to report on the gap between the deviation and the return, and what are the steps. Again, the Bank of England is the gold standard. Let me just put a couple of minutes into the Bank of England, and then we'll move to something else. When the inflation rate in England, or the United Kingdom, exceeds the target rate for, say, 2 months in a row, then there's something called the CPI letter. The CPI letter is a letter written by the Exchequer of the Exchequer. Think of it as the Exchequer as the finance ministry, where he or she writes a letter to the governor of the central bank of the Bank of England. The letter is public. It's not like, hey, how's it going? Right? But it's published. And in that letter, it is stated what has happened, and it is asking the Bank of England to respond to the queries raised in that letter, where the Bank of England has to explain why is there a gap between the inflation rate and the target rate. What measures are they planning to take? And how long would it take for the economy to get back to the target inflation rate? All of this is initiated by the Exchequer. Okay? The reason why I think this is neat is because the Prime Minister is elected, and the Prime Minister selects who's the Exchequer. And so there's an element of accountability on the central bank. The central bank cannot just say as it wishes. The central bank has to comply with guidelines from the government. And I personally like that. It's not that the central bank is self-regulated. There's an element of we, society, elected that guy. And that guy picked an Exchequer. And that guy is going to check the central bank. And the central bank cannot say, we don't care about your views. Okay. All right. What are the preconditions for this? Let me do this. I want you to ditch this. The external, Truman believes in that, because if countries with external and internal balance are rare, and those moments when they have internal and external balance are just brief. So they last about 15 minutes, if that. Unless, of course, we go and redefine external and internal balance to be anything we want, and so we know we have been external balance since the Stone Age or some weird thing. Okay, so what are the preconditions? It has to be a mandate. It cannot be just the central bank saying, hey, we read this article and it's in it name. Let's go inflation target. The central bank must have instrument autonomy. In other words, they cannot be regulated. The interest rate, which is the instrument that is going to be used, cannot be regulated. The central bank has to have the freedom to change that. But at the same time, the central bank has to be accountable. It's not that, well, according to our views, we should raise the interest to 300%. Hey, the Swedes did it, so we can. And not be accountable. Cannot have it both ways. So if you want to move the interest rate, you have to be accountable. This one is a little more important. Right? And inflation targeting involves a fair amount of human capital, the one you're developing here. That being inflation targeting is not involves a fair amount of forecasting. Forecasting involves a fair amount of knowledge about this functioning of the economy. Because if we don't nail that and pretend that we're having inflation targeting, all we're doing is introducing errors into the monetary policy process. So we have to nail it. Nobody's asking for perfection or perfect foresight, but we have to be very sure that all the alternatives were examined and not deemed worthwhile. Especially this. And if we cannot forecast inflation, we're not in the business of inflation targeting. And now, notice that, let me just put something here. Yeah. What I'm about to do is this. We suppose we have unanimous consent on the part of society to go along with inflation target. Suppose that we have all the preconditions. Suppose we have answered all these questions. And then the next issue is, fine, so what is going to be the equation that is going to enable us to translate macroeconomic developments into an interest rate? What is that equation? Not, again, I'm not asking, oh, the equation is that. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking something very, very specific. Okay. That's where John Taylor comes in. Now, he's not the only one who has proposed rules or equations that translate macroeconomic developments into policy decisions. But he is the most famous one, partly because he came up with something so simple and so intuitive that anything else looked convoluted and contrived by comparison. One of the things that we try to do in our line of work is to paint as much simplicity as possible. Okay? That's why we don't exponentiate the elements in the loss function to the fourth power, because we gain nothing and we complicate our lives in the process. So we don't want that. We want squares, because then the derivatives are linear. That's the advantage of the Taylor rule. And so that's what I'm about to do. Jason, before you ditch, did you bring candies to the class?
Sorry?
Did you bring candies? I mean, he went to Oxford recently. Yes?
Yes, but.
Okay, good. So, did you bring candies to the class?
No.
No, you're making it sound like you had no choice. Oh, I'm sorry, you're gonna get the candies now.
No.
No?
No.
No, wait a second. I know you wanna go to the bathroom, but we're holding on. So, should Jason bring candies to the class?
Yeah. British candy.
Okay, you can go and get the candies. O sea, go to the bathroom, get the candies, come back. wanna go back. This is the tail limit. Right there. Okay. Suppose that we're talking about inflation targeting, we're talking about having the government, the central bank being following rules instead of discretion. And then I show up with that equation. What would be your immediate reaction? Ron?
Looks familiar.
Is that your immediate reaction? It looks familiar?
That's the first thing I thought.
Okay, so what's the second thing?
Oh, it's simple. It's simple.
So it looks familiar, it's simple, and that's it. Those are not the right things that I want for you to get out of the course. What I want you to get out of the course is from where the hell that comes from. Why would I trust that? Tell me more. Be critical. Don't take this, oh, it's John Taylor, so, then, oh, in what part of the Bible that stuff shows up, right? I want you to be critical. And so what I want to do is to show the intellectual process that went into getting to this equation. Other than, I mean, I know that it looks familiar to you because that's the one you use in the simulation exercise. It's right here. And it had a different name when you were using this equation. The issue is, where does it come from? Why should I trust this? How do I know that this is good? And what's the alternative? How do you know what's the alternative? You get these questions always in your mind. Okay? Remember, they're gonna drive you to drink, but that's not so bad. I mean, so long as it's not crime or anything. Okay, here we go. So, what are the general considerations that go into the design of a rule? The first one is to recognize the monetary policy affects people's fortunes. If monetary policy didn't matter, then we just wasting time. But because people are affected by monetary policy, they're going to try to anticipate what monetary policy will do. You saw, and I read to you, the the press conference from Young. These guys are not just, let's see if Young knows the answer. Right? They're trying to ask a question that will enable them to say, we anticipate this is going to happen. And we anticipate this is going to happen, say, 6 months from now, so we take a decision today. They're trying to anticipate what monetary policy, not just for, say, I told you so, because they want to take a decision today, the benefits from that anticipation. They have seen the wave coming, and they're asking themselves, now what? Should we stay? What should we do? Okay? If monetary policies are misunderstood, then we're going to be making the wrong decision, and that's going to create a fair amount of uncertainty. And as a result of that, we're going to be and we don't like that, we as society, we're going to start putting resources into getting a grip on what monetary policy is. We're not working anymore doing something productive. We're not working in doing research to prevent cancer or do something else. We're doing research into how to anticipate monetary policy. And the issue that arises is, would it not be better for society's viewpoint if monetary policy could tell us what is it going to do instead of us trying to figure out what is it going to do? Would it not be easier? The answer to that, according is yes. We could save resources or reallocate resources away from guessing to something productive. Well, what are the trade-offs? Well, number one, monetary policy cannot affect output in the long run. If you are ever, if this action ever, if you say, how do I know that's true? Why is this guy second guess, go to entertain the alternative and carry out the mental experiment of raising money supply and see if you can get out. And so, we start with this. Monetary policy cannot affect output in the long run. And then comes the tension, but it can affect output in the short run. And if I were to make a nuisance of myself again, and I were to ask caution. Caution, wait a second. If it affects output in the short run, why don't we have a bunch of short runs, one next to each other? And then find that monetary policy can affect output in the long run. Why don't we do that? I mean, this is true. But if it is true in the short run, why don't we take a collection of short runs, one right after the other, and then manage to raise output in the long run? What gets in the way of that? This we have seen in class.
People's expectations adjust.
Yeah. And so what coaches is doing is invoking this diagram. So monetary policy moves from A to B, but eventually inflationary expectations change. And you have to go, this Phillips curve starts shifting up all the way to there. Notice how simple the answer is. We didn't have to go into some convoluted shape for the schedules. We didn't have to go into something that it depends. We said monetary policy can affect output in the short run only because expectations are given. But the moment monetary policy does something, those expectations get revised, and Coach in his own mind is moving that Phillips curve up. Now, he may not be moving the Phillips curve up, but he now has the principle that to the extent that the private sector react to the central bank, then to that extent, central bank cannot have a collection of short runs, look back and call it, oh, that's the long run, it's just a bunch of short runs. We learned that the central bank is trying to deceive us on a systematic basis every few months. We anticipate what the central bank is going to do it. So when the central bank tries to do it again, it can't. That's the point of this, okay? Where to go, Coach? Given this, how can the central bank exploit the short-run advantages of monetary policy without falling into the trap of high inflation to the future? How can the central bank go from A to B without winding up at point F all the way to the top? That's what the policy rule is trying to do. Try to exploit the trade-off between short run and long run. Trying to recognize that monetary policy can affect output in the short run and avoid at the same time the delusion that it can affect output in the long run. What that means effectively is that the central banks as currently designed are not after a particular level of the inflation rate or are not after a particular level of the unemployment rate, at least in this policy rules. They have redefined their objectives so as to minimize the instability of the economy, to minimize the volatility of output and the volatility of inflation. And so this is a trade-off between the variance of inflation and the variance of output. So if you want to lower the variance of output, you have to pay higher variability of inflation. And as in the example that you did, if you want lower variability of inflation, you pay a price by having a great variability of output. And so if the economy is here today, the objective of this rule is not to attain 2% for your employment, for the inflation rate, and 6 for your employment rate. The objective is to move the economy to that line. that work before? Check this. What you're seeing here is this is for the United States, the growth rates of GDP for the United States since 1950, maybe 1950. Check the period prior to, make this a little bigger for me. Check the period prior to 1985. So you can see the yellow area is, it's considerably more volatile than the blue area. Imagine that we were to just park an average growth rate. So that average growth rate of the United States was, even though it's an average, it had a fair amount of volatility. Check what happens afterwards. But it could, yeah, for all we know, it may be the same average. But the volatility of growth rate is considerably smaller. This is not by accident. This is not like, man, did we luck out? This is policy. This is what monetary policy is trying to do. Is to reduce the volatility of output. Why? Because then you can make decisions. What about the variability of inflation? Now, this is something else, right? I don't know how else to describe it. So when we talk about inflation targeting, we're talking about a monetary policy system that seeks to, in this particular case, seeks to have a lower inflation rate, but not just lower, but less volatile. And that's what has been a thing in the United States until the financial crisis. And that's what has been a thing in many other countries. And so notice that the success of inflation targeting is to be judged not whether how close the gap inflation is to the 2%, but the extent to which monetary policy is lowering the volatility of growth rate of output and the inflation rate.
Okay. If I'm just wondering now, we're reducing volatility. And I was just thinking in terms of the indifference curves. We're not going to F anymore.
Right.
We were originally in A. We had the chance to go to B, and this is where we could have gone. So in this regard, when we're having these rules, where are we exactly in terms of the indifference? Are we going back to where you're thinking, or?
Yeah. I don't know the answer, so let me see if I can hack it. No, let me hack it and then we'll see. Anybody else? Okay, so
Yeah.
I'm not gonna draw the difference curve because that was just fun, right? And so what we're trying is to stay in that area. He says, how the hell can you do that? Well, what allows you to do that? Well, in this area, it's allowing for the Phillips curve to move up and down because of inflation, because of oil price shocks, because of developments, the droughts. But what's important in this is to keep the inflation, the expected inflation rate equal to what, in this particular case, to zero. So long as the expected inflation rate doesn't change in response to what the monetary policy is doing, then you will have a Phillips curve moving up and down because of the shocks. But so long as the expected inflation rate is what we call anchored, then to that extent, this is what's being done. That's what's being done here. It's trying to say, look, monetary policy is a difficult affair. The economy is complicated and we don't know it all that well. What we can do is promise you that we're going to try to minimize the volatility of the unemployment rate and the volatility of the inflation rate. Okay. Saying that, people said, okay, this is not a crazy central bank, and that automatically anchors the inflation expectations. Which actually doing what we're doing, so that you don't say, these guys are completely nuts, and you don't revise your inflationary expectation. So the idea is that, let me see if I can say this, monetary policy is about the management of expectation. That's it. And managing expectation is about communication strategy. It is not about slopes, it is not about schedules, it's how do I convey to you that I'm doing the right thing, and that in case I'm not, I will fix it. That is monetary policy today. Management of expectations through a communication strategy. Slopes, fine, do as you wish, but they're just not going to be persuasive in the conduct of monetary policy. You would, if you were to hear something along the lines of, well, we're going to expand the monetary policy because, you know, we took a look at the LM schedule, and that LM schedule was kind of wimpy, and so we're just going to make it a little better by expanding. You just lose credibility. It has to be truly persuasive. Okay? Okay. All right. So let's talk about rules. What do we mean by a rule? Well, Phelan and Prescott had a definition of a rule that is, strictly speaking, correct, but idiotic at the same time, because it doesn't tell me what to do. It tells me, I were to get these rules from the heavens, then fine, then I will be optimal. But I want to know the rule. I mean, I actually want to know exactly what do I do, by how much should I change gas emission, by how much should I change monetary policy this day. If you don't tell me that, then fine, but we're not gonna call that a successful result. It would be like talking about a medicine that if we had it, then we wouldn't suffer anymore from, I don't know, headaches, colds, if we had it. And so then we says, well, let's pretend that we have it. And then we go, okay, so we're not affected by that anymore. Let's see what we would do with the extra time that we now have, and that takes off. But we don't have the time. And so whatever follows after that is fiction, is delusion. It's not, it is sure self, not central bank. Okay. So what are the rules? The first thing is that the rule has to use information consistently and predictably. It cannot be, you cannot have more than one rule, and you pick the rule that you want. One rule uses the information consistently and predictably. The rule enables you to predict what the central bank is. That is the point of the rule. We will then be predicting the central bank. And whenever the central bank departs from the rule it taught us was using, we start second guessing the central bank. At that point, inflation expectations are no longer anchored. Okay? So we're talking about this, right? How do we know that this is going to stay a fixed number? Or what will allow me to revise my expectation? I look what the central bank tells me, I look what happens, and if there's a big gap, or if that gap is systematic over time, I ditch that. I revise my inflationary expectation. Okay? Okay, so the rule, there's more than one rule that satisfies this. So, what are the nice properties? What properties should a rule have? The first one is that it enables us to anticipate what the central bank is going to do. Currently, the Federal Reserve doesn't have that. The Federal Reserve tells us that it has this target, that target for inflation, and it is seeking to minimize deviation, and it falls short of telling you how do you do that. So we don't have that. Hence, a bunch of questions that you get at the press conference. The rule has to be explicit. You cannot say, well, if the inflation increases, then the interest rate increases. Yeah, but by how much? So it has to be explicit. It is a bad idea to change the rules without a lot of forethought. And I think the Federal Reserve has been changing the rules lately. Maybe they went a lot of forethought into it, but my take is that the rules are changing. And the rule must be easily explainable to the public. In other words, if I say that a rule is the interest rate equals the cosine of the inflation rate divided by the tangent of the output gap, all this square root of it, exponentiated to what? To E. Is the damn thing systematic? Yeah. All you gotta do is put the inflation rate in the output gap and out comes what we're gonna do to the interest rate. Is it easy to see? No. I mean, unless you are in this line of work every day. And so that's where Taylor is gonna come in. And there's more than one way of getting these rules. This is one that works fine. Except that, you see it and say, that doesn't do crap to me. Nothing. Okay. Let me start with the gymnastics. Here's the beauty of the Taylor rule, or the derivation of the Taylor rule. And so that you know where we headed, my take is that it wasn't that John Taylor said one day, man, I'm stuck in this circle. The fly was canceled, so now what? Well, why don't I put a little time into deriving some rule? That's it, that is not it, right? So there's a fair amount of reverse engineering in this type of result. You know what you want, you know what you have to use, and the question is, what gymnastics do you use in the middle to get what you want from what you have? It's not that you're gonna say, this is what I got, now what? Well, now, what we did, most of the time what we do is we take logs. Well, why would you take logs? Why don't you just divide it by 6? The issue is that a lot of what we do presumes that there's an answer at the end, and that we have a sense of what the answer is, and then we work backwards. Okay, this is the so-called quantity theory. This is one of the more important questions in economics. This is the money supply times the velocity of money equals the value of production. It is truly amazingly important. Okay? And so, incidentally, as a matter of general practice, the guys in my line of work see an equation. I mean, they may not know what the symbols stand for. I don't know what they are. But they know what to do. And the very first thing they're going to do is take logs. They don't know what the symbols are, but man, when you see an equation, as a rule, take logs. And then we're going to talk about it, what happens after. So, okay, so what have we done now? Well, we went from the quantity theory levels to the quantity theory in logs. Right? It's the same quantity theory. Nothing has changed. Now comes an important assumption. That is that the log of velocity has this particular shape. And the log of velocity depends on the interest rate and amount. This is not a particularly controversial assumption. So when we write if you were to write a demand schedule for money, this is demand for real balances. This is the interest rate. What we would do is say to do that. So that when we say the money is inversely related to the demand for money is inversely related to the interest rate, we're doing something akin to that. Okay. All right. So now the next step is to substitute this Darwin into the log for the money supply. And so that's what I'm doing here. So what I do is solve for the money supply. And I'm now going to substitute this guy in there. It's going to be this. And now I have that what I'm after is the interest rate. So I solve for the interest rate. So here is an equation for the interest rate. Notice how in 2 or 3 easy steps we went through a quantity theory plus an equation that determines the interest rate. This is not the one we ultimately going to use. Okay? But notice, right? So is this an equation that is really weird? No, not particularly. Just take a look. So if you raise output, the interest rate will increase. If you raise prices, the interest rate will increase. If you raise the money supply, interest rate will decrease. So it is not a really weird equation. It is consistent with whatever understanding we have about the functioning of the economy. So far, and now this is from a pedagogical standpoint, Taylor is on the radar screen. He said, start with quantity theory, make an idiotic assumption about velocity, substitute, and I'm now looking at this particular equation. Have I lost my clientele? No, because my clientele knows this, and they're just waiting for something really weird to happen, and so far it hasn't. All right, so Taylor continues. All right, the next thing he says is let's take changes. Now, most of the time when we have an equation, when we say delta YT, what we mean, or what we normally use is YT divided by minus YT minus 1. So it's the change relative to the previous term. That's not the sense in which he's using changes in here. Okay? This is, so what we're gonna do is just, we're gonna start taking changes of that, right? So here's the expression in changes. Nothing has happened. Quantity theory, idiotic assumption, quantity theory, logs, idiotic assumption, expression for the interest rate, the changes of the interest rate. So far, nothing controversial has been assumed. And it is about now where things get a little more cumbersome, because I'm going now to define the change in the interest rate, not so much as the interest rate of today relative to the previous period, but the deviation of the interest from a target rate. Okay? So the element of time is not really there. I'm defining the change as the deviation between where I am and where I want to be. So this is the target interest rate, this is the actual money supply. The change in the log of the money supply is what's called the structural inflation rate. Now we're beginning to introduce novel concepts, at least from Taylor's standpoint. What do you mean structural inflation rate? The idea is that if you were to plot the growth rate of the money supply and the inflation rate, there will be a relationship among them. That relationship is the structural inflation. Now, all of this came to be second guessed with the recent expansion of the money supply of the United States. And people were saying, we believe that if you expand the money supply, the inflation rate will increase. CBB, we did increase the money supply, the inflation rate did not increase. So there's tension. And that's a good chunk of the discussion in the United States, it's a good chunk of the discussion in Japan, it's a good chunk of the discussion in Europe. In Japan, it's even more puzzling because they have increased the money supply and inflation rate declines. So you can imagine that if we have it back, the Japanese have it even worse. So, or at least more puzzling. It is a piece of work there. Okay, so we're going to define the change in the law as a structural inflation rate. This is not going to be particularly controversial. What we're going to do here is to define this term as the gap between the growth rate and potential growth rate. And it is at this point that I'd like to bring Megan, for example. Megan, what do you think is the growth rate of potential output in the United States? I need a number.
I don't know.
I know you don't. That's why I'm asking. So, but nevertheless, right?
Yeah.
Suppose this is a job interview. What are you going to say? You don't know?
Maybe.
No, you don't want to say I don't know.
I would think maybe around 2%.
No, it's 2.5. And some people have different views on this, but it's not 8, it's not 0.5. So, what do you think, Ariel, potential output in the euro area. Again, say it again? Around the same. And if I were to ask, say, Matthew, what is the growth rate of potential output? Matthew's over there. What is the growth rate of potential output in China? What will Matthew say?
7.5.
Okay, so China 7.5. I mean, I don't have any evidence to that, but I want to differentiate the growth rate of potential output from the growth rate of output. I think you're talking about the growth rate of output, or maybe you're talking about that they're now the same, and I'm just trying to create tension where no tension exists. Tension where no tension exists. That's what I'm doing. He's saying yes. Jesus Christ.
Oh, no, sorry. I was thinking about like the question earlier, like the difference between growth of the output and the like the
Wait a minute. What is the growth rate of potential output in China? About, we're not, this
I would say 3%.
3%. So Matthew has about more than twice that. So you, okay, so yes, what's my answer? I don't know. That's why I was asking the two of you, so I'm in trouble. Okay. Ivan, what's the growth rate of output in Canada? Don't look too wrong because he knows the answer to that. Could it be so different than that? So what is the growth rate? Around 2%, okay. And so if the economy is growing above 2%, then we are growing above potential, and that's going to have implications for the interest rate. If the economy is growing below 2%, 2% is not a magical number. 2% is the one that we have agreed among ourselves that represents something like potential growth rate of output. If that were the case, then that's going to have a different set of implications for multi-laws. Let me stop now. So you are going to be bringing the homework tomorrow to and or is that right?
Did you want them to put it in the CA office in their mailbox?
Yeah, that's fine. But you know, have you been to the economics department? So just if you haven't, this will be an opportunity to be disappointed because you're thinking that there are going to be carpets and paintings and this sort of junky thing. So go there. In there, there's there are two things. You can either go to the office at 718, and if I'm not there, just put it on the door. Or in my mailbox, which is the same. I don't remember the email. So go to room 718, put the key underneath my door. And okay. Remember to do the comments that I had at the end of the second lecture. You don't have to bring them. But I want you to make sure that you are